looking at the golden rule. I knew Cookie had already been reading the lesson because she made a post about J.C. Penney's on Facebook, right? And it came from this lesson, and that J.C. Penney was called the Golden Rule Store. Isn't that right? The Golden Rule Store. I'm not old enough to remember that. Now Cookie probably is, but who? Kathy? Oh, I don't remember it either. But apparently their slogan was the golden. They were the Golden Rule Store. That was their principle, the founding, our foundation of the way that they were going to conduct their business, and that's over on page 74. Now, the Golden Rule is found toward the end of the Sermon on the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 7. I'll be honest with you, it's found in a very odd place. When you're reading and going through the Sermon on the Mount, that statement of whatsoever you would that men should do to you, do ye even so to them, for this is the law and the prophets, it's in an interesting place because it follows a series of texts where, for example, it says, what man is there if his son asks him for a fish, would give him a serpent? In another place, if he asked for an egg, would give him a stone. If he asked for bread, would give him a stone. Luke's account speaks to this in Luke 6 and verse 31, and that's the text that is repeated through the lesson. But what we do learn from this text is that Matthew 5 or Luke 6 were not the only times that Jesus taught this. In other words, this was something that was a regular, what we call the Golden Rule, was a regular part of the teaching of Jesus. By the way, Luke 6, in a lot of ways, is a mirror of Matthew 5, 6, and 7. You can find the Beatitudes in Luke 6. You can find love your enemies, judge not. All the things that you can find in the Sermon on the Mount is found in Luke 6. But Luke 6 is the Sermon on the Plain. It says he was in a very flat place when he preached that sermon. And so, this golden rule, as we refer to it, was a part and parcel of the regular teaching of Jesus. And so, with that in mind, looking at page 73 says, it's not difficult to read or to understand the golden rule, but it can be difficult to practice. And that's, of course, the case with many things that we read in our Bibles. It's not difficult to read, it's not difficult to understand, but it can be very difficult to put into practice on a day-to-day basis. And so there are 5 areas that Tim has chosen to kind of examine how the golden rule ought to be lived and applied in our lives. And the first is the golden rule in business, that the golden rule should guide and govern our business dealings. A number of years ago, now, when I was a kid, I read the Reader's Digest faithfully. I loved the Reader's Digest. And if I had, I can remember even if I had to spend some time with my Uncle Waif and Aunt Barb, and people used to keep them things. You had the Reader's Digest, and then there'd be like a whole shelf. There'd just be, years, as if there was something, they were so valuable that you kept them. And I remember my Aunt Barb had a bunch of old Reader's Digest, and the great thing about Reader's Digest was they were kind of timeless in a lot of ways, the way that they were put together. And just right at the end of the year, you could get all 12 in one volume. But I remember years ago reading about they did a test where they took basically a brand new car, and they drove across the country. And they would stop at all these they'd stop at some little old, for example, back then gas stations and repair shops were still kind of one and the same. There's still a few of those around, but not like there used to be. But they'd stop and and they would stop at some place, and they'd say something. They'd say, something's, back down the road, my car started not running right. And so they would have the local mechanic look at the car. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with the car. And sometimes what they would do, and I think the principle what they were doing is they took one of the spark plug wires off. And so they come in there running rough with one spark. And all they'd done is, about 5 miles back up the road, they'd stopped and taken the wire off and pulled in and asked what the problem was. And then they documented all the things that people tried to do to their vehicles. All the things people tried to do to their vehicles, when all it was that any mechanic would have seen immediately was that spark plug wire was loose. And every place that was honest and said all it was a spark plug wire, they named that place. And all the places that tried to rip them off, they didn't name those places. I don't know why. They should have named those people. But they didn't name them. But they went back about 5 years later and did the same thing again. And they pulled into a place, and the guy said, it's just a spark plug wire, and he put it back on, and he said, no charge. And in the course of that conversation between the people driving the car and that mechanic, he said, I'd be afraid to rip somebody off. He said, I read in Reader's Digest about 5 years ago about mechanics ripping people off down on the side of the road. And he'd actually read that article that they were a part of some years ago. And so, but that's just one area wherein people can really take advantage of other people. And I say it all the time. You want to know why? You want to know why there's about 5,000 cars parked out in front of Big Boy Automotive? Because people know they can trust John to do right. That he's not going to rip them off. And if he can fix it, he'll fix it. And if he can't fix it, he'll say, I can't fix it, or whatever. And honest mechanics they're worth their weight. They're worth their weight in gold. Contractors, same way. Builders, contractors, people that do that type of work. They're all areas wherein most of us do not have the kind of expertise to know whether or not an individual is honest. And so we want to be a people that would be noted and marked by our honesty. It speaks well of the church when church members are known to be honest businessmen or women or whatever area that they might be in. And so the golden rule would be practiced. I don't know what people I don't know what people who make a practice of ripping off others think when they get ripped off. You ever wonder that? If there's a mechanic and he's all time ripping people off, 50 here, 100 here, 500 there, how does he respond if he gets ripped off in some way? Does he just say, "Oh, that's just life"? I knew I had to pay it back sometime. They probably don't look at it like that. And so, but we want to be a people that are marked by integrity. I'll give you an example. Some of y'all know I sold Jeffrey's car a couple Sundays ago. I put it online, put a price out there. Somebody said, "Will you take this?" I put it online. What was the day? It was the day that Josh Woodard got married, April 24th. That's what day it was. I put it online at 2 o'clock or 2:30, and my phone was blowing up all afternoon. People wanting to know about this car. Well, finally, got home from the wedding. Somebody said, "Well, will you take this for it?" And I said, "I would." And they said, "Well, I'll be there tomorrow." They were coming from Mississippi. I said, "I'll be there tomorrow at 1:30. And so Sunday morning I got up and somebody asked if I'd take the same amount for it. I said, "I would, but I've already got somebody that's agreed to pay me that for it, and they're coming at 1:30. So they offered me $100 more to sell it to them that morning. And I just said, my integrity is not for sale. I should have said, now you make it 10,000, I might... my integrity is not for sale, and it sure enough ain't for sale for $100. And then they apologize. They apologize for saying that. But we need to be people For example, in Psalm 15 and verse 1 to 4, where David says, who can ascend into your house? Who may dwell in your holy hill? And then there is a list of types of characters who God approves as worshipers. And one of those characteristics is found in verse 4. It says, he who swears to his own hurt and does not change. He who swears to his own hurt and does not change. In other words, in my case, when I gave that guy my word that I'd meet him at 1:30, I'm going to meet him at 1:30. It doesn't matter if somebody offers me more money or twice as much money or whatever. I could have, look, in our day and time, $100 is not that much. But, the Bible says he who is faithful in little will also be faithful in much. And so we want to be faithful in little, and so that we can be trusted with much. And so, when we say we'll do a thing, we'll say we'll be somewhere or whatever, then we're going to keep our word. And so that's part of doing business. Now, in the example that's given, it's talking about that people will categorize or compartmentalize various aspects of their life, and part of it will be my work, and part of it will be my faith, and part of it will be my family. And of course, the problem with that is that Jesus demands to be a part of all those things, not just, as he describes, not just one spoke in what we might say the wheel of life. Jesus demands to be the hub. In other words, everything comes out of the hub. So if you were going to draw it like a wagon wheel, that the outer part of the wheel would be the entirety of our lives. The hub of the wheel would be our faith or our relationship with the Lord, and then everything in our life emanates from that hub. In other words, Jesus is the hub of my family life. Jesus is the hub of my work life. Jesus is the hub of my political life. Jesus is the hub of my recreation. In other words, no matter what it is in my life, my hobbies or whatever, Jesus is going to connect whatever that is with my life. So it all centers in Christ. Now, there's also an opposite view of that. I don't mean an opposing view, but there's another picture that is painted for us in Titus chapter 2, which is the opposite of that. Not in the perfect, the illustration, but in that when it says that God God has made us a peculiar people. A peculiar people. That's the King James rendering, a peculiar people. The word peculiar there means a people of his own special possession. And that's an opposite picture where we're in the center and God surrounds us. That's what the very word means, that we're in the center and God has us completely surrounded. The Old Testament, as the song says, a wall of fire about me. The song, I Found a Friend in Jesus. That part says, a wall of fire about me. When I was a kid, I never did understand that. And then I got old enough and I found it in the Old Testament that God said, I'll be a wall of fire. And we understand, fire is in this case is a protection. If you're out camping, a fire can protect you or whatever. And so you have both pictures there. That when Christ is the hub of our life and everything emanates out of that, then at the same time God surrounds us in every aspect of our own lives. Down on the bottom of page 73, about 7 lines from the bottom, it says, some adults do not seem to understand that permanently borrowing something from the office is the same as stealing. In Titus chapter 2 and in verses 9 and 10, there is an admonition for people who work for other people. Now, the King James Version says, and none of us probably even would know what this word means today, it says, not purloining. P-U-R-L-O-I-N-I-N-G, purloining, not purloining. Well, New King James says pilfering. Pilfering. Now we know what a pilferer, what pilfering is, right? It means take just a little bit at a time. All right? For example, if you've ever seen somebody eating grapes at the grocery store, which I have many times, that's pilfering. That's just I don't have enough gumption to steal the whole thing. Or they put grapes in their cart. They put grapes in their cart, and then they walk around and they eat off of it the whole time. And then they weigh about half as many grapes as they had when they started. That's the concept of pilfering. Now, somebody would, but you say, you stole those grapes. Oh, I paid for them. Well, you paid for the grapes that you put on the counter, but you didn't pay for the ones you put in your stomach. That's pilfering. Employees can pilfer from their employers by, taking items at work that you need at home, whether it be ink pens or postage or scissors or they're just little items, but that's the whole concept of pilfering. It's just a little bit. It's not a whole lot, but it's still the amount is not relevant. The amount is not relevant, and so the Bible teaches us to provide things honest in the sight of all men. By the way, we can also steal our employer's time. We can steal our employer's time. When we clock in, we owe whatever time it is until we clock out for break or lunch or quitting time. That time belongs to our employer, and we're paid for that. In other words, there is an agreement that when I clock in, I'm going to work for my employer, and when that time is up, then that's my time. But when I'm on the clock, it belongs to my employer. And we can pilfer from our employers by pilfering time. And so these are all areas that many times we don't think about it, because in our minds we think, well, it's just a small thing. It's just a small thing. But small things can add up. Can add up eventually. Over on page 74 is the account on of J.C. Penney. But I had a couple passages that I had in my mind that I thought I would read in regard to employers and employees. In Colossians chapter 3, for example, in Colossians chapter 3 and in verse number 22. Verse number 22. The Bible says, "Bondservants, obey in all things your masters according to the flesh, not with eye service as men pleasers, but in sincerity of heart, fearing God. And whatever you do, do it heartily as to the Lord and not to men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the reward of the inheritance, for you serve the Lord God. But he who does wrong will be repaid for what he has done, and there is no partiality." And so what this means is not with eye service as men pleasers. That means that the picture here is that, and if you've ever worked in a manufacturing environment, and I have, or in other environments, there's always somebody that's just busting tail when the boss is around, right? I mean, he just killing it at work whenever the boss is around. But when the boss is gone, what? His work falls off. Might even fall off the cliff. In other words, when somebody's watching, I'm going to give my very best effort. But when the boss man's not watching, I'll do as I please. That's the concept here. Not with eye service. No, not with the things that can be seen. Not just when somebody's watching. You do right all the time. And it says, and you do it with the understanding that when you give your employer your very best effort while you're on the job, you're actually serving God. It says, knowing that do it heartily as unto the Lord and not unto men, because you will receive the reward from the Lord. In other words, the Lord will, if you're a Christian, the Lord will reward you for being a good employee. But He'll also punish you for being a bad one. In other words, being a bad employee can cause people to lose their soul. I won't name the place, but I know now, and the dynamic has changed through the years. But I know of a manufacturing environment where one of the employees is a member of the church. He works out on the floor, and one of the supervisors is somebody that I know and very close to that is not a member of the church, but has very close ties to the church. And the person who works out on the floor will spend 15 minutes trying to figure out how to get out of a 5-minute job. And he has that reputation of being lazy, trying to find ways out, to get out of doing work. And guess what? The person that I know who's in management, who knows him, knows that about him. And he also knows he's a member of the church. Now, if you ask that member of the church if he would ever do anything that might cause somebody to not want to be a Christian, what would he say? Oh, no, I'd never be a stumbling block for anybody to be a Christian. And by the way, and I know that this guy is pretty evangelistic in his everyday life. He invites people to church, invites them to gospel meetings, and in many other ways, he's a very exemplary individual. But he has a reputation at work as being lazy. And his being lazy, I promise you, is a detriment to this other person obeying the gospel. It's a detriment. And so Colossians 3 says, what we do as unto the Lord, knowing that the Lord will reward us. Then you have on the other half of this side of this coin, is chapter 4, verse 1 in Colossians. It says, Master, give your bondservants what is just and fair, knowing that you also have a master in heaven. In other words, this is a two-sided coin. Those that are servants are to render service to their masters and in view of the Lord, and masters are to make sure that they treat their servants properly, also in view of the Lord, because the master himself is also a servant of the Lord. And so we find, and by the way, there's the parallel of that's in Ephesians 6, but Colossians is a little more in detail, and that's why I used Colossians. But we need to be mindful of our practices in our business, our work, our employment, to make sure that we honor the Lord in all those things, practicing the golden rule. Then page 74 and 75 deals with the golden rule in our personal boundaries. Now, this section of the text pertains to the matter of sexual purity, and most of this in the top half of page 75 deals with those who are single, primarily teenagers, young adults. If you want to marry a Christian, then you want to live a Christian life, so you can find a Christian to marry. In other words, if you want to marry a Christian, then you need to live like a Christian. So because if you don't live like a Christian, you're not going to attract the kind of person that you want to marry. And so we have that in the top half, bottom 74, and top of 75. But it also applies to the area of marriage, that we have to watch ourselves in the matter of marriage. Hebrews 13:4. Marriage is honorable among all, and the bed undefiled, but fornicators and adulterers God will judge. And the admonitions found in about 3/4 of the way down says, be a one-woman man with your eyes, with your thoughts, and with your bodies. It says every Christian husband should strive to follow that advice, not just because adulterers will be judged, but because they understand and appreciate the implications of the golden rule. And I also added off to the side, be a one-woman man with your words. With your words. We have to be very careful in our conversations, particularly as men. And the part about a one-woman man with your eyes is also particularly important for men, because there's no secret that men are far more likely to be visually stimulated than women. And so the idea of guarding our eyes is extremely important for men, and guarding our words. On the other hand, and I'm putting this thing on both sides, both men and women have to be extremely careful in regard to the use of their words when dealing with members of the opposite sex. Because while men are generally visually oriented, stimulated, women are relationally oriented and stimulated. And so, for example, if a woman is having some type of difficulty in her marriage, she does not need to talk to a man about the problems that are in her marriage, because you'll find some man who's going to feign interest in your problems and tell you everything that he thinks that you want to hear, and he's going to lead you down the wrong path. By the way, I've seen that happen many, many, many times. That if you have a best friend that you confide in as a female, it needs to be a woman. And in the same way, men need to, if they have difficulties, obviously you need to talk to your spouse. But if you have someone that you use as a sounding board, or an ear or a shoulder, however you want to describe it, it does not need to be a person of the opposite sex. Because again, the same thing you find, a man complains about his wife to a woman, and then you end up in the exact same thing. She's going to start saying things. She's going to appear sympathetic, and that thing's going to go down. It's going to go down the wrong path every single time. Also, if you find yourself being the object of someone's conversation, you've got to get out of that conversation. Sometimes what they call water cooler talk can, for lack of a better term, get a little electricity in it. And if there's ever any inclination that there's some kind of spark in this conversation, it has to be quenched. It can't be toyed with. It can't be just ignored and then wait for the next water cooler conversation. Those matters have to be handled. Over and over and over again through the New Testament, the church is warned against sexual immorality. That was one of the number one issues that the church faced and continues to face even to this day. Well, for example, in Acts 15, when you had what we call the Jerusalem Council, and when Paul and Barnabas went to Jerusalem to meet with the apostles and elders about these Judaizing teachers, it was said in Acts 15 and verse 20 that it was the determination of the apostles and the elders of the church at Ephesus to tell them to abstain from fornication and from blood and from idols. So there were three things. There were three things that they thought were most important. First of all, they denied that they sent the Judaizers. When the Judaizers pretended that they'd been sent by Jerusalem. That was a lie. And they said, look, we didn't send those guys. It says, but here's what we do want you to know. Abstain from fornication, eating blood, and idols. So, and by the way, that letter was circulated. And Paul even spoke about that same letter later on in another epistle. But that was one of the top things that the apostles and elders wanted the church to know. Guard your sexual purity. Then you have the church at Corinth. 1 Corinthians 6:9, know ye not that the unrighteous shall not inherit the kingdom of God? And where does that list start? Fornicators, idolaters, and adulterers, and then homosexuals. Again, sexual purity was at the top of the list. And then you get to the end of chapter 6, it says, flee sexual immorality. It says, because when a person commits sexual immorality, they sin against their own body. They sin against their own body. And Paul says, you've been bought at a price. Therefore, glorify God in your body and in your spirit, which are God's. And so, again, the admonition, what is it? Sexual immorality. Revelation 2 and verse 12, the church at Pergamos, the church at Thyatira, both of them, warned about idolatry and sexual immorality. Again, And then John's letter, the very last line of John's first epistle, 1 John chapter 5, it says, "Little children, keep yourselves from idols." Well, why would he say keep yourselves from idols? Well, it wasn't just the matter of idolatry, it was all the things that were associated with idolatry. And the number one thing associated with idolatry was sexual immorality. So over and over and over and over again, the New Testament writers are warning the Christians to maintain their sexual purity. By the way, I think I made mention this a while back. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, in verses 3 and following, Paul indicates that there were some members of the church that were practicing sexual immorality with other members of the church. He says, possess your vessels in honor. Abstain from fornication, sexual immorality. Possess your vessels in honor. Let no man defraud his brother in this matter. So there was sexual immorality going on in the church among the members in Thessalonica. Of course, we already know what was going on in Corinth in chapter 5. And so this is always a problem for mankind. Sexual immorality is always lurking. And to entrap people. Then on page 76, the golden rule in our speech. In our speech, James chapter 3 is the bulwark chapter on the matters of the tongue. It says that the tongue is small. Verse 5, it's powerful, it's destructive, it's unruly, it is incredibly inconsistent. In other words, we bless God and curse men with the same mouth. And he asks the question, does a spring bring forth good water and bitter water? And he says, how is it that the spring of your tongue brings forth good water and bitter water? Because no spring brings forth good water and bitter water. It's either bad water or it's good water. And by the way, we might use that as an example. Elisha turned a bitter well into a good one. Remember that? The waters, they called it Mara, which was the Hebrew word for bitter. They said the water is poison, and miraculously he purified that well, obviously through the power of God. But and kind of like Matthew 7, a tree does not bring forth good fruit and evil fruit. You don't get two types of fruit. And so our speech is incredibly important. For example, Matthew chapter 12, verse 37 says, by your words you'll be justified, and by your words you'll be what? Condemned. By your words you'll be justified, and by your words you'll be condemned. Now, this is out of context, but it's still nevertheless true. All right? I'm giving you the disclaimer up front. This passage has been taken out of context, but it is still nevertheless true. When Peter was in the company of those that had taken Jesus into custody, they said, "We know you are a Galilean because your speech betrayeth thee." Now, they weren't talking about the words that he used. They were talking about his dialect. In other words, the way that he talked. It's kind of like if you've ever gone anywhere outside the South, people know you're from the South because your speech betrays you. Not the words that you say, but the way that you say them. All right, that's what it was talking about. But it is still yet nevertheless true that our speech will betray us. Right? Not the dialect, not the accent, but the words that we use betray us. We can profess to be Christians on Sunday, but if our language mimics the language of the world on Monday through Saturday, our speech has betrayed us. It's betrayed us. For example, it's the very epitome of Titus chapter 1. It says, they profess to know God, but in works they deny Him. And they say they're one thing, but what they do says the very opposite. And our speech is the same thing. That I can profess to know God, but if my language does not reflect a child of God, my speech it hadn't betrayed me, it's exposed me. It's exposed me. And so our language has to be we have to be very careful in our language. For example, 1 Peter chapter 3 and beginning in verse 10, it says, "He who would love life and see good days, let him refrain his tongue from evil and his lips from speaking deceit." Earlier, he used Jesus as an example. It says, Jesus also suffered for us, leaving us an example that we should follow in his steps. And what was the very first thing they said about Jesus? "Who did no sin, neither was any deceit found in his mouth." And then it goes on to talk about when he was reviled, that's language. When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, again, mouth, but committed himself to him who judges righteously. And so the tongue, the tongue is truly an unruly evil. And it says the man that's tamed the tongue is a perfect man. The man that's tamed the tongue is a perfect man. It doesn't mean he's sinless. It means he is fully mature, spiritually speaking. He's fully mature. And so we need to strive for that type of maturity, so that our speech accords with our claims. All right. Page 77, the golden rule in spreading the gospel. I think this is pretty well a no-brainer. If I was lost, I'd want somebody to help me. The vast majority of this world is lost. Now, look, as Rob taught us back in January, there's planting and there's picking. Planting and picking. It's our job to plant, and it's the person's job to pick. And what he meant by that is that we plant by giving them an opportunity. Then they pick whether or not they want to take advantage of that opportunity or don't want to take advantage of that opportunity. He says, you plant and let them pick. And so our job is to be in the continual process of planting, giving people opportunities to study the Word of God. And and look, the more you plant, the more success that we have. And so we want to be extremely mindful of that. And so we want to practice the golden rule in spreading the gospel. And then lastly, he talks about we want to practice the golden rule in our giving on page 78 and 79. James 1:27. I've never thought about this passage in the context of our giving, but it would certainly apply. It says, pure religion and undefiled before God the Father is this, to visit the fatherless and the widows in their affliction and keep himself unspotted from the world. And so the word visit there means to look in on with the intent to relieve where necessary. Well, that wouldn't, of necessity, would be a reflection on my willingness to be a giver. And I've talked quite a bit about giving on and off over the last several weeks. Of course, Matthew 25 is really a giving text. We think about the sheep and the goats, but what was the difference between the two? The willingness to give. I was hungry, you gave me meat. Thirsty, you gave me something to drink. Naked, you gave me something. Gave me something to wear. I was sick and in prison, and what did you do? You gave me your time. You came unto me. You gave me your time. And so these are all giving texts. That there's more to giving just than the financial side. And so, and I'd encourage you to spend a little time reading the bottom page 78. Actually, just above that on the spreading of the gospel is the two passages, or the verse and chorus of "You never mention him to me." But spend some time, if you get a chance, looking at page 78 and 78 and 79, and talking about our giving. So